Hey everybody, this is Mike with On Point Preparedness. This is a third video for the week. I'm sort of on a roll. I better not jinx myself. But in this video, we're going to be doing something a little bit differently. When I started my channel, I had done tons of videos on prepping, on the truther stuff, Illuminati stuff. Then the Lord really started convicting me to back away and get more into ministry. Also to warn people about signs of the times and things like that. But this particular topic regarding hyperinflation and this really weird conundrum where a lot of the world governments are rolling back COVID restrictions, I think this really does warrant a video because I've heard a theory on it from another Christian channel, and it was a little bit too top level in terms of the financial jargon that I didn't quite understand it. But I looked into it a little bit more, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Again, this paradoxical thing where a lot of people were saying, hey, the New World Order, they're putting down all these COVID restrictions. They want to control everyone. And then all of a sudden, all those restrictions just started going away. And there's a whole lot of theories on why they're all going away. It stems from people in the conservative movement saying that it's because the people are winning, right? They didn't expect this big of a pushback. And so, the trucker convoy in Canada, that's why Trudeau removed the country emergency, the state of emergency, and he rolled it back because of the pressure. Or in New Zealand, they just lifted all the restrictions, and it's because we've kept the pressure on. I really don't think that's the reason. There's probably other theories as well why they're all removing them. But giving this knowledge that we have that there is a great reset that they're trying to accomplish, I think this is all very much coordinated. I really do, and I will share with you why we have this sort of paradoxical thing going on where, the seemingly the controllers of this world, if you will, are easing these restrictions, which a lot of people thought would be permanent. A lot of people also think that they're going to come back, but as I'll show you here, I don't know if they will or not. So let me just go on over here to the screen share and just share with you what I'm learning here. And again, this is totally just all of opinion, but it makes a lot of sense. So we'll start with this article. Take back life. More nations ease coronavirus restrictions. And I'll share with you some articles later on. Some of the most draconian countries, like New Zealand, like Britain, like Israel, they're all just completely doing away with everything. So it's very interesting. Some financial expert who told a friend of a friend who told this other Christian YouTuber this information, they said that basically when you start to see coordinated removal of statewide, countrywide COVID restrictions, it means that it's signaling that there's going to be a change in the markets, or there's going to be a change in inflation to potentially yield hyperinflation. Maybe not immediately, but this is going to be somewhat of a catalyst. It's almost as if all the COVID restrictions and the lockdowns are a dam that have been holding back lots of the quantitative easing or the money printing by the Fed. And as soon as this is opened up, basically the money gates are going to flow, and there's just going to be tons of money flooded into the system. If you don't really know what all that means, quantitative easing and everything like that, I'm going to try to explain this in the simplest terms that I can. Because again, I am not an expert on monetary policy. I'm sort of just feeling my way through the weeds on this one. So apologies if I get anything wrong, but this does make a lot of sense to me. So all these nations are almost in a coordinated fashion easing up restrictions. Some of the most draconian restrictions as well. Well, looking at monetary policy, and specifically we'll look at the Federal Reserve, but this really applies to like any of the central banks across the world. There's a term called quantitative easing. And if you're not really sure what that means, it is just a fancy term that was developed around the 2008 banking crisis and housing crisis, which allowed the Federal Reserve just to print off tons and tons of US dollars, tons and tons of money. And so what you're looking at is the federalreserve.gov balance sheet. This is basically all their liquidity, all their assets, dollars that they have out in the system. And you can see a strong inflection point during the banking and housing crisis that we had back in 2008. Huge QE1, I think they called it, quantitative easing rush of money that was injected into the system, right? The too big to fail banks were propped up. They weren't wiped out. They were just propped up. There's band-aids put on really bad banks. And people said, this is going to bite us at some point. I remember listening to all the truther channels, all the financial truther channels back then. They're saying this is going to lead to hyperinflation. Lots of truther channels were all saying that. And so that went on for some time. And then there was I don't know how many rounds of quantitative easing there were. It was like QE2, QE3. There maybe have been a QE4. I mean, you can see the inflection points here. Maybe that's 1, that's 2, 3, and then 4 here. But then look at what happened with regards to the pandemic. That completely dwarfs any of the quantitative easing that was injected into the system due to the financial crisis. And it really is showing no signs of stopping. It's exponential. But even though this has been happening since 2008, and lots of the truther financial people that I was following, I was sure that back in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, that everything was going to crash. And a lot of those truther financial analysts were surprised that it hadn't. They were saying this, what you see on the screen, this leads to failure. This leads to failure of monetary policy. It leads to runaway hyperinflation, but it never happened. And the reason it never happened is if you look at a different chart called velocity of money. Now, what is velocity of money? Basically, well, let's see here. I don't have the definition up on the screen, but basically this is a measure. I don't know how exactly they track it, but it tracks the velocity or the movement of dollars as it's exchanged for goods and services in the economy. So it's almost like every single dollar bill, this is just an analogy, every single dollar bill has a little tracking mechanism on it, and they can see how quickly it moves through the economy. If money is changing hands, very quickly, it means the goods and services are passing through the economy and through people very quickly. It's a sign of a good, healthy economy. And it can also be a sign of there's just a lot of money, that there's a lot of money changing hands. But at the same time, when there was tons and tons of money being injected into the system, the global economy as well as the U.S. economy was not doing well. So look at the inverse relationship of these two graphs. Okay, we've got huge amounts of money being pumped into the system with the first inflection point at 2008 versus the velocity of money, which is completely inverse. And you see from 2008, it is dipping down all the way to the coronavirus time, and then it just plummets. Now, why is this? Again, thinking about velocity of money as basically a graphical representation of how quickly money is flowing through goods and services within the United States. Well, in 2008, there was really no recovery. And we've never really had a real good recovery ever since then. It's been a lot of smoke and mirrors in terms of saying, this, all the presidents have looked at the stock market. The stock market's doing great. It's doing great. But we all know that there is this disparity between Wall Street and Main Street, if you will. Those taglines there. But, this shows that money really isn't moving through the economy ever since the initial crash. And what that signifies is that people really, there's not a whole lot of goods and services being traded. People are holding their money back. It's not a sign of a healthy economy, especially that you can see this relationship very easily here in with regards to the COVID pandemic. All the economies globally were shut down in 2008. And so because everything was shut down, naturally, money is not going to flow. And that's why you see this unbelievable catastrophic drop in the velocity of money right around 2020. And it's never really recovered. And so you'll see some articles. We're just going to go through two, and then I want to share with you a whole bunch of articles in terms of like what is going to happen here with these coronavirus restrictions being removed. This was written in 2014, and it really explains these two graphs that I shared with you. You know, pumping the economy with tons of money, but that money isn't moving anywhere. It's getting stuck somewhere. The money's going somewhere. It's just staying in that initial spot that it's going, and it's really not moving throughout the economy. Okay, we get this inverse relationship. So this article in 2014 said, what does money velocity tell us about low inflation in the U.S.? Again, 2014, before a lot of this stuff happened. So they give us this very simple equation. MV equals PQ. M stands for money. V stands for how quickly that money is moving through society. P is a generic symbol standing for the general prices of goods and services, and Q stands for the amount of goods and services in the economy. And so what they say is, based on this equation, holding, if we held the money velocity constant, in other words, our economy is not growing and our economy is not decreasing, we're pretty much stable state. If we keep that money velocity constant, if the money supply increases at a faster rate than the economic output, basically all your prices are going to have to absorb all that money. Think about it this way. If you start flooding the economy with all this money, goods and services are going to have to absorb those prices like a sponge. If you and me are in a black and white room and there's $5 and only one apple for sale, well, that apple is going to be $5. If we throw another $5 into that room, well, now suddenly if that apple's the only thing for sale, now that apple's not worth $5, it's worth, $10 because that's the only thing for sale and there's $10 in that room. Goods and services sort of absorb those prices like a sponge. And so it's saying that, again, if the money supply increases very fast, rather than the real economic output, the prices are going to absorb money like a sponge and make up the difference. According to this view, inflation in the U.S. should have been about 31% per year between 2008 and 2013, when the money supply grew at an average pace of 33% per year, and output grew at an average pace of just below 2%. So again, between 2008 and 2013, looking at this, the amount of money that they were injecting into the system was about 33%. Imagine all your goods and services increasing 33% year on year because of what the Fed did here. But it didn't happen. And so what this article is saying, well, why didn't it happen? Well, it's because of the declining velocity in money. The issue has to do with the velocity of money, which has never been constant, as can be seen in the figure below. If for some reason the money velocity declines rapidly during an expansionary monetary policy period, it can offset the increase in money supply and even lead to deflation instead of inflation. So this was the exact same chart that I had showed you, the velocity of money. While the Fed was pumping the balance sheets, that money was just going into the hands of a very few select people, particularly the banks. And then the banks were lending that money out to very particular people that were using that to invest in the stock market. And so the vast majority of the money that you see here, which is hyperinflationary, this is hyperinflationary. But this money didn't make it to Main Street. The money just all got stuck into the bank's reserve sheets because the banks were still shady and they were still shaky, and they were holding the money as a protectionary measure. In case they did fail, they wanted cash reserves, sort of like you and me. We want to have cash reserves in our savings account just to shore up our, our financial sovereignty or our financial health. The banks were doing the same thing. They were not really on good ground, so they saved a lot of this cash that the Fed was giving them and just kept it. And when they did loan it out, they were loaning it out to a very select group of people that were then pouring that into the stock market. So continuing on with this article, it says, so why did the monetary base not cause a proportionate increase in either the general price level or GDP? The answer lies in the private sector's dramatic increase in their willingness to hoard money instead of spend it. Such an unprecedented increase in money demand has slowed down the velocity of money, as the figure shows below. So all this money was, again, being printed. The vast majority of it was staying in the banks just to prop them up. When it was being loaned out, it was being pumped into the markets. Any money that was making it to Main Street, people weren't really spending because they knew the economy really wasn't that healthy. And so when that money is not moving through your society, the velocity of money, when it's decreasing, there is no hyperinflation. There really isn't, because the money's not moving. It's all just being stuck in a safe somewhere, if I could use an analogy. So that's the reason why we haven't seen hyperinflation yet to date. So then, how does this translate then in terms of when will the dams burst on this? Well, that's where I think this ties into nations easing coronavirus restrictions. So let's continue on with this. I think we're done with this article. Yes, we are. All right, let's move on to one more article, and then we'll look at a whole bunch of news articles which sort of support this theory. One thing. So remember, I said a lot of this, wrong chart, a lot of this quantitative easing and the Fed just running the printing presses and creating lots of money, it just got stuck in the banks. And when the banks did loan that out to other people, it was being invested in the stock market. I mean, that's exactly what we see here. This is a good chart that I saw from Zero Hedge. So this is asset prices of basically all the indexes of the stock market. You can see like 900%, 950% increase of the NASDAQ, 550% increase of the S&P. You can see all the stocks and investment strategies are all just sucking up all that money that was printed out. But if you look at Main Street, real economy prices, it hasn't hit yet. So again, the money that was created, it is going somewhere, and we see it mostly all tied up here. But let's continue, because when do these dams break? I found this. I don't know anything about the deep dive site. Don't know anything about the author, but I found this to be a very simplistically written article that helps someone like me understand what was going on. So they have, again, a very generic equation here regarding GDP, money supply, and money velocity. So GDP is your gross domestic product, your final goods and services in an economy over a period of time. Velocity, as we've discussed, is how quickly money turns over between goods and services spent in the economy. And then your money supply is basically everything that the Fed prints out and injects into the economy. So this was written in 2020. That's going to be a very important date here. I think this was right around the time that the pandemic was really starting to pick up speed here in the States. Back in 2020, spring of 2020, where are we at right now? He says things are bad, catastrophic. We haven't seen jobless claims or declines in productivity like this ever. Over the course of 3 weeks, we've seen depression-level declines for almost every area of the economy, absent for staple food products and essential services. Buckle up, the world's about to change. Politicians are no longer asking us to shut down the economy. They are forcing us to. He talks about velocity. He says velocity, in regards to the COVID pandemic, has come to a grinding halt. When you shut down the economy, you are really shutting down velocity. That is exactly what we see in the velocity of money chart directly from the Fed. That is, I don't even know what percentage that is, but that is dramatic. So, because you've got this equation here, he says, what happens when the pandemic slows velocity as it's happened in this chart? When economies are shutting down, people are locked in their homes, they're not spending money, how do you make it appear as though your economy is still functioning? Okay, so if you have extremely decreased velocity with the same money supply, your GDP is going to go down per, this equation that he has here. GDP equals velocity times money supply. So again, the countries don't want to look like they're failing, especially to like their adversaries around the world. So in order to make your country look good, and you want to have positive GDP, if you have this unbelievable drop in velocity, and GDP equals velocity times money supply, well, the only way to get your GDP up and out of the roof is to dramatically increase your money supply. And that's what it says. Jack the money supply, baby. Our great leaders will turn on the printing presses and start handing out cash to everyone. And so that is what we've seen. Forget about quantitative easing QE1, QE2, QE3 for the banking crisis. What has happened in 2020 and on, is dramatic. And the reason why is because of this completely inverse relationship where, everything was getting locked down, people weren't spending money. And so to have this appearance that everything's functioning, we're just going to jack up the money supply. Obviously, I've showed you in the previous graphs and things like that, the inflation hadn't hit Main Street. The inflation hadn't hit Main Street yet. Okay, a lot of that money was still being caught up in, again, a lot of these institutional, elite powers. We're going to cover a lot of how this money was created as well. There's a lot of injections into the economy via the CARES Act, which was passed by Trump, and then you have the Bring Back Economy Act, or whatever it's called, from Biden. But anywho, we'll get to that in a second. So what are the side effects? This author says, eventually the economy will kick back on and velocity will speed back up. That's incredibly important. So if you shut down the economy, and this is what it does to the money supply, thereby, preventing hyperinflation because money isn't moving. What happens when everyone across the world, all these nation leaders, even the most draconian ones like New Zealand and Israel and all that, what happens when they all just decide to say, hey, lift all the restrictions, let it all go. Take life back. More nations ease coronavirus restrictions. Let's just forget about the green passes, forget about vaccine restrictions for travel. Just open it all up. It's going to be the inverse. The author continues, let's assume the money supply is now over 2 times the size it was before the pandemic started. And remember, they wrote this in 2020. If we go back to the same productivity levels as pre-corona, then expect twice the GDP. So in theory, we would have twice the GDP as before with no change in productivity. Basically, the economy stayed the same. We're not producing more. We're not producing less. It's just that there's a whole bunch of money now tied up in the system. And now that people are going, the nations are now not under lockdown and people are going to spend money. What's the difference, you ask? Inflation. Okay, that's the reason why. The only thing that has been holding inflation at bay is the money supply, or the money velocity. People have not been spending money. And not just the people on Main Street, but again, the elitists as well. The variable we can't account for in economics is human behavior. History has taught us that when prices, now this is very important as well. History has taught us When prices start rising at hyperinflationary levels, people want to get rid of their money as fast as they receive it, speeding up velocity even further, known as runaway inflation. So how likely is hyperinflation? The author continues, the longer the economy stays shut down, the more money we will print, increasing the risk of this outcome. And remember, this article was written in April of 2020, nearly 2 years ago. They say every day that we continue these lockdowns and the money velocity stays super, super low, and the Fed, thereby trying to raise up GDP, keeps on doing quantitative easing and running the printing presses, the worse and worse this is going to get. And, as he says, when the economy eventually kicks back on and velocity speeds back up, that's going to mean that the prices of everything starts to finally realize all this money supply that the feds have been printing out. So they have this little chart here. The tail risk increases every day of the shutdown, and we've been countries across the world, and China's still going through some shutdowns as well, which are impacting the supply chain. Since this article was written, we've had 2 more years of this, and so now inflation is the hot topic in the news. The mainstream media is talking about hyperinflation now. So you're starting to see that the dam is opening up, and the seams are starting to break. The core of this, the core mechanism, because a lot of people, if you turn on a lot of the channels today, they're all going to be talking, and the mainstream media, they're all talking about hyperinflation. Before they said it was transitory. Now everyone knows it's not transitory. Even the Fed and all the people in the mainstream are saying that and we're going to have inflation for some time to come now. They're admitting it. They're not admitting hyperinflation yet, which a lot of us see the writing on the wall. It's just, I don't know if people really understood the mechanism for how it happens or why it happens. And I think this is it. In that the lockdowns were one way to justify this. The lockdowns increased our money supply dramatically because the velocity of money dropped so much. And now the chickens are going to come home to roost once the economy kicks back on globally, all the economies. No more restrictions, go back to life as it was. And then everything's going to absorb the prices to a dramatic degree. Okay, so we got out of the articles here. Let me start to share with you a lot of the current news events that are happening which support this theory. So in tandem with a lot of this quantitative easing and the Fed turning on the printing presses ever since 2008, here's just some of the recent bills and acts that have contributed to that. So we all know that there was the pandemic stimulus checks. So this was one of the first times in which it wasn't the banks that were directly getting this money, and it wasn't the banks lending to the top investors who are then putting that into the stock market and inflating just the stock market. Now the money is starting to flow into Main Street. Now all the people are getting the money. And some people saved it, but a lot of people were spending it. Here was the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act, which helped businesses survive the pandemic. Here's the PPP data from the U.S. Small Business Administration. Total PPP volume, nearly $800 billion was loaned out to small businesses between 2020 and 2021. And there's a lot of controversy with these PPP loans. You can actually have those loans forgiven where you don't have to pay back a dime. And there's actually tons of YouTubers who weren't affected by the pandemic at all because they were just, doing these YouTube videos from their home, and they were applying for PPP loans and getting like $40, $50, $60, $70, $80,000 in PPP loans. And they applied for forgiveness because they had good tax consultants, and they were getting that forgiven. So it was like free $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. So I just know that was a big controversy as well. But almost $1 trillion given to small businesses, and so that's another injection directly into Main Street. Trump signed a $2 trillion coronavirus stimulus bill, so that money went everywhere. That includes Main Street and Wall Street and the banks, I'm sure. Now, this late 2021 through today, the American Rescue Plan, Biden's $2 trillion stimulus package. Again, that's injecting money in both domains, the Main Street and the Wall Street. This is a recent article, March 23rd, 2022. Now lawmakers are proposing a $100 energy rebate stimulus check to offset high gas prices. Not sure if this is going to pass or not, but again, not only are you seeing the dollar notes from the Federal Reserve pumped into a nice siloed little box just in the banks and just in loans to the high rollers in the stock market. Now you're starting to see it all start to spill over into Main Street. And that is affecting prices. In addition to the supply chains, again, the supply chains are hurting, and that is also contributing to inflation. But if you look at the core of it, it really all relates to money supply and money velocity. Let's continue here. Where did I leave off? So we got that, and so here. So coronavirus lockdowns cause this dramatic decrease in the money supply, which has kept hyperinflation at bay. Same thing with the weak economy and the money being tied up just in banks and the stock market has kept hyperinflation at bay. But now we've got all these stimulus bills which are giving money directly to people on the street. And all of a sudden, almost in a coordinated effort, you have all the countries globally starting to ease restrictions. And as I said, there's lots of theories for it. Some people are like, yay, the people are winning. I was like, I don't know about that. I think what's going on here is much more tactical and has been planned for some time. That I don't think, these elites who are planning the Great Reset were completely fazed by some protests. I just don't believe that. So New Zealand lifts all restrictions. The UK to drop all remaining restrictions. Israel, Green Pass set to expire. And if you're not vaxxed, tourists are allowed entry. And so here, again, this has been happening since 2001. But here's what's happening across the world. There's a psychological component to this as well. So, a lot of people have been saving their money. It's been a very tumultuous time. It was an uncertain time. A lot of people were putting money in their banks. If they received some of these stimulus checks, some of them were spending it, but a lot of people may have been saving it. And maybe now a lot of these restrictions are starting to wane. Now they're thinking about spending that money. People want to take vacations. They've been cooped up. There's been a lot of psychological issues because of the lockdowns and everything. So now that all the restrictions are suddenly going away, start to get all these articles. Britons will go on $50 billion spending spree when COVID rules are lifted. Report. Consumers are eager to spend as COVID-19 restrictions lift. Americans go on a spending spree a year after the peak. Spending spree in Donegal pubs after lifting of COVID restrictions. I thought this had an interesting title. With pandemic-weary consumers ready to spend, the roaring 20s and celebratory times ahead may be very real. So I thought that was not a really good thing to say, considering the roaring 20s were followed by the Great Depression. But, that's from the Chicago Tribune. So going back here to all this mumbo jumbo about quantitative easing and money supply and money velocity. Again, here's a different article, and this was in 2018, before all this pandemic stuff happened. Why didn't the Fed's quantitative easing program cause massive inflation? And they say the exact same thing. One reason it didn't cause massive inflation is that much of that money the Fed created never actually made it out into the real economy. Really, that money just exists as digital zeros and ones on a computer server that didn't have much impact on the economy. It's only when the bank loans out those reserve balances that they became high-power money that interacts with the real world. And then the second reason quantitative easing didn't cause hyperinflation is that the economy was headed full steam in the opposite direction, towards deflation. And people in Main Street, let me find the right chart here. Yeah, here's 2008 money velocity. Because the economy was not in good shape, people really weren't spending money. A lot of people were saving. So that's what that article is saying, is that the economy is actually heading in the opposite direction. And with what money was printed, hyperinflationary money printing, again, that was getting stuck in the banks. And when it did trickle out of the banks into loans, that was all being pumped into the asset prices of the stock market, which we know is not the things in the stock market are not the real value that they should be. There was a lot of articles several years back about how people were amazed that Facebook doesn't really have a really good revenue income, but yet it's worth, I don't even know how much it's worth, this many millions of dollars or whatever, when they don't even bring in that amount of money as a company. So again, it's just all inflated asset prices that are in the stock market. But with everything that I've showed you to date, when they start, just letting people do whatever they want, you're going to have a potential reverse here. And again, all the chickens, all the little dollars, they're going to come home to roost. And I said this is a multifactorial type of issue here with regards to hyperinflation. So it is supply chain issues. It is, at the very heart of things, quantitative easing, the money supply and money velocity, but there's other things as well. So this is another thing. This is somewhat older, but if you've heard about BlackRock, it's a financial elite institution. They're really buying housing across the United States. It's one of the many reasons why some think that the housing prices are increasing so much, is because institutional investors are pushing those prices higher. So again, BlackRock is one that is probably top on the list with getting a lot of this stimulus money from the Fed, and they are injecting it now recently into the economy, into Main Street via these mortgages and these houses. So that's another vehicle here. In addition, we also have Putin saying unfriendly countries. This is a very recent article. It's only a couple days ago. Unfriendly countries must buy Russian oil and gas in rubles. And so there's a little bit of history here, and I'm already at 38 minutes, so I don't want to go too much longer. The only reason why the dollar is the world's reserve currency today is because of a phenomenon called the petrodollar. Basically, we had a gold-backed dollar because after the world wars, we had much of the world's gold in the Federal Reserve, or we were supposed to have all a majority of the world's gold in the Federal Reserve, and because we had that collateral, people trusted the U.S. dollar. But then, around the Nixon administration, they started printing off tons of dollars for all sorts of social programs and who knows what. They were just turning on the printing presses like no other. And that started causing other nations to start to question whether we really were being responsible with our monetary policy. And so any countries that had gold in the Federal Reserve's bank, sort of like as an investment, they started withdrawing it, to the point where Nixon actually took the dollar off the gold standard, so it wasn't backed by anything. But him and Henry Kissinger, what they did was they made some deals with the oil-producing nations called OPEC, and they said, hey, we will give you free military aid, we'll give you all sorts of good stuff if you promise us to sell your oil only in dollars. And they said, hey, yeah, sure, that sounds great. We will sell your oil in dollars. And because the world operates on oil and gas and everything like that, and because the only way you could get it was to get dollars, that really propped up the dollar. There was now a demand for dollars because of the petrodollar. If a country wanted to get oil and they had to go to the OPEC nations to get it, it's like, okay, fine. We don't really like the U.S. We don't like your monetary policy, but we do need these dollars to get our oil. So again, it was called the petrodollar. It propped up the U.S. dollars as continuing on as the world's reserve currency, even though we were no longer backed by gold. But what you're seeing is lots of countries, not just Russia and China, but lots of countries starting to engage in de-dollarization. They don't like the United States' control of the world and their sanctions and things like that. They want to get away from the dollar. So they are de-dollarizing their trades. And this is just one of many ways in which Russia is doing that. He's saying, you know what? I'm not going to accept dollars. I want you to pay me in rubles. So again, that's going to decrease the demand for dollars. And if you start to see this spill over into multiple other countries, basically, I've said this before, the chickens come home to roost. The dollars come home to roost. As countries ditch the dollar and the dollar's significance or prevalence in that country starts to wane, they naturally start to retract to countries where they still are accepted. And the very last place where they will be accepted is where they were generated, which is the United States of America. And so as you start to see these issues with money supply and money velocity, as you start to see supply chain issues which cause inflationary prices, you're also having this de-dollarization throughout the world and the removal of the petrodollar, which is going to bring more of that money, which was spaced out all across the world, back into the United States, which further can influence the pumping up of prices. But going back to the main topic here, I don't think all the nations suddenly out of nowhere removing restrictions is because of some protests. I think this is very much planned. I think it really does have something to do with everything that I've just mentioned. And I mean, this thing is way bigger than people really realize. And if anything, this should really show you, like, there's way more going on in the world than just some other transitory event, like a world war or something like that. I mean, I've said for many years now, I believe we are the terminal generation. And that, you know, we will be able to realize and see a lot of things that are prophesied in the book of Revelation. And seeing things like this, again, there's no amount of prepping that's going to save you. There's no amount of strategy that's going to be able to get you out of this. You know, the Bible in Revelation 6:6, it does talk about hyperinflationary events. You know, these things are certainly prescribed and are prophesied as coming, and it seems like they are. This is really where, if you are not currently a Christian and you haven't put your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, I'm going to have some videos in the YouTube description box so that you can see what the gospel of Jesus Christ is, so that your soul can be saved, because everything in this world is passing away. A lot of the truthers are saying this type of monetary policy, not just by the Fed, but by central banks around the world, nothing like this has been done in the history of the world. In the history of the world, nothing has gotten to these levels. And so when this crashes, and it's not a matter of if it crashes, when it crashes, you know, it's going to be very dramatic. And, you know, this world is passing away. The Bible says that don't put your trust or your faith in things that moth and rust will destroy. Everything in this world is going to pass away. But our hope is in our salvation through Jesus Christ, who took away the sins of the world through his sacrifice. And so if you are a Christian, we really need to maintain that relationship with our Lord Jesus Christ so that he sustains us through this. It is by your faith and the word of your testimony that you will be able to endure these things and help save other people. And if you're not currently saved, again, I have a video about the gospel of Jesus Christ. It will be in the YouTube description box shortly after I end this session. And so I say all that because these are some really serious things, and it can cause fear. And that's really not where we should be. And if we are fearful, that fear should be used to drive you towards something positive, which again is cultivating your relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ if you already know him, or if you haven't known him and you see what is on the horizon. This should show you that there's more to life than what is passing away. So again, that will be in the YouTube description box shortly after I end this. Curious on everyone's thoughts regarding this theory, but again, I don't think this is by accident. I think this is very much by design. I don't know how quickly it will come, but everyone knew the quantitative easing policy, especially with what has happened in just 2 years. I mean, people thought this was bad back in 2008. That's unbelievable, really, if you look at it. It's not sustainable, and it's going to crash at some point. So again, you prepare for this as well. I think first and foremost is your faith. If you focus on your faith, then God will add things to you. Your faith in God is first and foremost, and he will sustain you through everything else. But again, as I've mentioned regarding physical prepping, which there is prudence in having the wisdom to see these things and what is coming, you should be prepared. You should have, if you can, and if your faith tells you to prepare, you should be having some food on hand. If there's an emergency where you need to leave for either weather issues or, unfortunately for all these people in Europe that are having these potentials for war, you should have a means to, take you and your family out of a particular place. So having, bug out bags or things like that. There's some prudent preparedness. You don't have to go overboard. And when I say overboard, another thing is, when you look at this is really destruction of money. You should not take this information and just say, I got to spend everything. I just got to get rid of my dollars. I got to, invest in hard assets and gold and silver and do this and that and just buy, 5 years worth of food. That is likely not an action of faith. I did a video about prepping in faith versus prepping in fear. Videos like this, if you start to go on a spending spree, probably not dictated by faith. That is probably prepping in fear, and that's not really a good thing. But if you can calmly look at this information and see what's on the horizon, and you go and you seek counsel with God, and you pray to him, asking him, what should I have prepared for this within reason? That's a more appropriate way to handle this information. And I hope that a lot of people digest this via the latter. So with that, I think I've said enough. Hope this information helps you. And again, if you currently don't know the Lord, video on the gospel of Jesus Christ will be in the YouTube description box. That's very, very important. So this is Mike with On Point Preparedness. Hope you enjoyed this. God bless.